I think this is a really important conversation to have with respect to the backdrop that we find ourselves in society, right? So we hear all these narratives about, oh, money is the root of all evil, or I've seen things like wealth is murder, that type of stuff, right? And, ultimately, all money is a technology that we discovered through necessity, like we talked about, right? And so to explain that further, we need to take a step back and really talk about what society looked like prior to money, okay? And what we ultimately had was extremely inefficient trade. And trade is where I enter a transaction with you, right? Where I say, hey, I have a good, let's say that I'm a chicken farmer, okay? And you are a strawberry farmer. Well, in this instance, if there's no money, if I want strawberries, I have to hope that I come across you, right? And I also have to hope that you as a farmer of strawberries, and I also have to hope that you also want to trade your strawberries that are in season for my chickens, okay? And my chickens have to be healthy and all of that stuff. So the cost of doing trade through this barter system, which is what we had prior to money, was very inefficient, right? Sometimes it took months for us to complete a trade because of the seasonality of goods. And we had to always have this coincidence of wants present through this barter system. And this coincidence of wants ultimately led to an inability to perform economic calculations because, again, if I want strawberries, but you're a blueberry farmer, well, I have to go searching that out, and that's really hard. So naturally, what happened throughout time is people started to converge on goods that ultimately are very saleable. And what saleability ultimately means is the ease to sell that good onto the market at any time that I desire for the lowest cost possible. And so the most sellable goods naturally became the goods that we started using as money throughout human history. And so when we think about saleability there's really three components, okay? So the first component is going to be scale, and then the second component is going to be space, and then the third component is going to be time. So an example of this is gold, right? Gold isn't the first thing that we used as money, but it's naturally evolved into one of the better forms of money throughout history because of the credibility of its monetary properties with respect to those three components of saleability. So in terms of scale really just means how divisible is it and how recombinable is it as well, right? So in my example, if I have chickens and you have a bunch of strawberries, well, how do I know how many strawberries is going to equal a full chicken? Or what if I just want 2 strawberries? I can't just cut my chicken down, right? Otherwise my chicken dies and now the trade isn't going to work, right? So gold was divisible to a point where it was easy to cut it down so it could facilitate smaller transactions. And we could also recombine it into bigger value amounts so that we could trade it for bigger things that were much more valuable in nature, like a house, for instance, or something like that, right? So that's the first part is scale. That's extremely important.
So also, I would imagine that, it's easier to ensure the quality of gold than it is to ensure the quality of a chicken or the quality of a strawberry, right? Like you have 100 pounds of strawberries, they might look like good strawberries, but you don't really know until you eat them. Right. But with gold, there's sort of tried and true ways to figure out how much value of gold do you have in this moment, right? Like it can be melted down and it can be weighed and it can be, you can be sure that it's, roughly speaking, it's worth what we both think that it's worth.
Right. And that gets into the next 2 points, which are space and time, right? So gold is essentially durable and reliable through space. And what that means is I can transport it, right? And so it has ultimately a high value to weight ratio. So what that means is I can store a high amount of value in a small piece of gold, right? Like an ounce of gold, which is like about that big, is worth well over $2,000 right now. So it's transportable relative to some of these other goods, right? Like transporting a bunch of chickens is going to be much harder than transporting a small amount of gold, right? And so that's the salability across space. It's lower transport costs and it's also more efficient to transport. And then the ultimate one is time, like you're talking about, with reliability and durability. So the good has to be able to hold up through time in order for you to store value in it, right? So when you're saving your money, that money needs to hold up throughout time and not diminish in value. And so certain goods lended to these properties better than other goods. And so like the strawberry example, right? I could try to store my value in strawberries, right? Hoard up my strawberries, and I can eventually trade them for other things. But those strawberries are going to go bad eventually, right? They're going to rot, and so they're going to lose their value over time. Gold is very durable. It persists throughout time. It doesn't change throughout time, right? It remains consistent throughout time. And then the biggest thing here, the most important thing in my opinion, and I would say in most people's opinion that really study this stuff thoroughly and throughout human history, is this concept of scarcity, right? If someone is choosing a good because it stores value across scale, space, and time, well, then they're naturally going to demand that more, right? And as more and more people demand that, right, more and more people are going to want to produce more of it. So this good needs to naturally be inelastic to demand. The good supply needs to be inelastic to demand. And what that ultimately means is it has to be really costly, both in terms of like human capital and resources, and also in terms of time to go produce more of it. Otherwise, a bunch of people could just go produce things like seashells in the past that were used as money in human history. So Native Americans used seashells, which were great because they were relatively scarce within North America for these tribes that used them to trade back and forth with one another. But as soon as colonists came, they realized that seashells were being used as money. They introduced gold coinage, which was much more scarce than seashells because colonists could go find seashells a lot easier and introduce a lot more into the market. And so ultimately what happened is money is nothing more than a means for us to communicate with each other and keep score. So the simplest example I use is, let's say there's 10 goods in society, right? And there's $10 in society, or we'll just say 10 seashells using the example that I've been using. So in this society, there's 10 goods, there's 10 seashells. Each person has a seashell, there's 10 people, right? So naturally, let's say like all goods are relatively about the same value. They're each going to be worth about one seashell, and that's how trade's going to work. But if I'm able to go quickly, if I come into this market and I see that, oh, all I have to do is get a lot more seashells and I can control the goods and services, well, then all I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the shores. I'm going to find a lot more seashells, rare seashells and things like that, and introduce them into this market of 10 seashells. Well, if I find 10 more in a small amount of time and it's relatively easy for me, I can introduce them. There's now 10 seashells plus another 10, that's 20. I get to spend those 10 seashells into the new market. So the market hasn't accommodated yet for the fact that the supply of seashells just doubled. So I can buy these goods at the one seashell rate, and I can buy up all the goods and services and create wealth for myself just by easily introducing less scarce seashells into the market. And so that's why scarcity is so important when it comes to money. For money to uphold its value throughout time, it has to be much harder to produce more of it, right? Its total base that actually exists, the new introduction of new money to that base has to be a very small percentage of the total base that already exists. Otherwise, you start to experience things like the devaluing of the money that people use. But the biggest thing is the free market determines what money is best based on the credibility of that individual goods, monetary properties. And so throughout free markets in history, each individual started to realize that certain goods would be able to be exchanged to other people more so than others. So individuals started choosing those goods to save their money and then facilitate trade with. And so the markets from that individual standpoint started to collectively converge on the goods that were the best forms of money. And that's how we went from seashells to cattle to salt to even like cigarettes and prisons to eventually converging on monetary metals and ultimately converging on gold, because gold best represented these monetary properties. And the biggest thing is gold is the most scarce compared to all these other goods that have been used throughout human history.
For more conversations about why the 21st century is going to be the strangest time in the history of the Earth, be sure to subscribe to the Highly Uncertain podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or iTunes. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. a really cool company that offers professional counseling and therapy services online and on your own schedule. Learn more at betterhelp.com/Chris. See ya.